Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Pehei. Daf Pevav. We're going to get started with the bottom from the bottom of Pehei Amud Bet. So we're continuing, and we're going to kind of seal up our story of Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon that started with that, which already morphed into a different story, right? We started with Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon. We then moved from him to Rebbe, because as soon as he died, Rebbe kind of tries to step into his place by marrying his wife, which doesn't really work for him. And then we moved on to Rebbe with all kinds of different statements, and we'll kind of summarize that. And with that, we end with the final story of Rebbe, which is Shmuel Yarchina'a Asye LeRebbe Hav. Shmuel Yarchina'a, which is the term they called him, although we normally know him as Shmuel. Okay, so he's the guy, perhaps Yarchina'a, because he knew about this, the moon and the planets. He was both an astronomer, he was a doctor, a scientist, and also a Talmid Chacham. Okay, very knowledgeable Torah scholar. Who is he, Shmuel? He was the first generation of Amoraim. Him and Rav were the main rabbis of the time. And here we're at Rabbi Yehuda haNasi, was the end of the Mishna time period, who obviously knew Shmuel because Mishna, Gemara, right? It all, that ends, that one starts. So he was the doctor of Rebbe, Chalash Rebbe Be'ene. He had a problem with his eye. 4 lines from the bottom of Pehei Amud Bet. Amrle imale sama. He says, I'm going to put these drops or some sort of formula in your eyes. Amrle lo yachilni. He says, no, I can't handle that. It's too much. Eshalach mishtar. I'll put an ointment on it. Amrle lo yachilni. He said, no, it's too much for me. Hava motiv la begufte desamne tote besadya v'itase. So what does he do instead? Shmuel puts it in a reed, like a hollow reed. He puts the cream inside. He puts it under Rebbe's pillow. Okay, which, can't really go through the pillow. This actually reminds us of all the pus and all that stuff that came out, went through all, it wasn't through pillows, but it was through all the things that Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon was lying on. Here it's going to go the reverse. It's going to go through the pillow into the eye of Rebbe, and it actually, it cured him. So Shmuel miraculously heals Rebbe from his eye issue. Rebbe now is desperate to give Shmuel smicha, okay, because he's such a brilliant person, also doctor, also scholar. He wants to give him smicha. Now, you might have paid attention to this, you might have not, but it's very interesting that Shmuel is called Shmuel. He's one of the unique figures in the Gemara who doesn't have a name Rav, okay? Not Rebbe, not Rav. So Rebbe tries to give him smicha, but it just doesn't happen. Rashi says, why doesn't it happen? Either sha'ani trefet, like you go to do something and all of a sudden something happens right then and you can't do it. Or lo yu chachamim ne'asafim, or the rabbis just couldn't gather. He couldn't get all the rabbis together to do it. It didn't happen. Amar le lo litztar amar. So he says to Shmuel, listen, don't be upset. L'didi chaze le'sifra da'adam harishon, because I found this book of Adam harishon. Okay, interesting that Adam harishon had a book, right? There's a tradition that there was this book of Adam harishon. And in that book, it says the following thing. Just want to look up one thing before I go on. Right, that's what I wanted to check. It's Shmuel who says it. Right, Shmuel says, don't bother yourself. Okay, my mistake. Shmuel says, I was thinking as I was reading it that maybe it was Shmuel who said it. Okay. And by the way, the Yarcha is not just he knew astronomy, but he understood, if you remember, we've talked about this before, he understood the whole Kiddush HaChodesh, like how it works with the moon and all the, the cycles of the moon and how to determine the new month, and also the Ibor Shana, which was much more complicated, what year, all that. That's why he was called, when you need to add a leap year in the lunar calendar, that's also why it was called Yarcha. Anyway, Shmuel says to him, listen, Rebbe, don't be upset about this. L'didi chaz, because I found in this Sefer of Adam Rishon, and it says there, K'tivbe, Shmuel Yarchina Chakim Yitkari, he will be called a Chacham. It's a wise man on account of all of his knowledge, worldly knowledge. The Rebbe lo Yitkari, but he will not be called Rebbe. Va'asu de Rebbe al Yadotehe, but he will be known for having killed Rebbe. And that will be my claim to fame, and it's okay, I'll live with the fact that I won't be called Rebbe. This goes back to this idea that we've been talking about, humility. And he was okay with that. It's fine. And with that, we end this section by saying, Rebbe v'Rabbi Natan Sof Mishnah, Rav Ashi v'Ravina Sof Hara'ad is a very famous line. Rebbe and Rabbi Natan are the end of the Mishnah time period, right? This is, in fact, we're getting a story of Shmuel, who's the first Amora, and we're basically saying They were the end. Okay, Rabbi Natan was actually from Bavel. He was Rabbi Natan Abavli. He's much less known. It's very strange why he appears here, because most times when people quote this line, what they're really trying to say is that Rebbe was the editor of the Mishnah. It wasn't just he was the end of the time period of the Mishnah, but he actually edited the Mishnah. And Rav Ashi and Ravina were so far, meaning they edited the Gemara. And there's a whole debate about this. Does it really mean they edited it? Does it mean that they were just the end of the time period? There's a big debate about which Ravina we're talking about. There's different Ravinas. And we've already discussed this, but we'll mention it again here, that Rav Ashi and Ravina are around the year 500. And after that, there's a lot of other things called the Sforaim or the Stamaim, who appear without names, who actually, their text ends up in the text of the Gemara as well. So even if we say they edited the Gemara, it's not exactly the whole Gemara that we see today, because some of it was added in the later time period, right after, the next few hundred years after that. So we even saw once in a blue moon, you have a section from the Tkufa Geonim, which was the next Tkufa, which started in 800. There's a very, very famous line, V'simanech. And how do you remember Rav Ashi and Ravina? Ad Avraham mikdashi el, Avina la'acharitam. What do you see in this pasuk? A reference. Mikdashi is like Rav Ashi, sort of. Okay, their simanim are always a little sort of. And Avina like Ravina la'acharitam. And acharitam is the end, meaning, right, they understood the end. Right, they're both, I will come to my mikdash and I will understand their end. They symbolize the end of a generation. Rabbi Natan, what's he doing here? In fact, I looked in a book that I like to use. It's called Encyclopedia L'Chachmei Talmud Geonim. Looks up a little bit about Rabbi Natan. It's this book. And he says in there that Rabbi Natan isn't even mentioned in the Mishnah more than twice. And both times it doesn't even appear in the early manuscripts. He's actually not even in the Mishnah. So it's very interesting that we attribute, if we say self-Mishnah, they edited. And it's an interesting question. Was he involved in the editing of the Mishnah? First of all, there's a book called Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is like Pirkei Avot, and it's all attributed to Rabbi Natan. So maybe we're talking about a different book in that time period. Perhaps it's unclear what this statement means. Perhaps it's just saying he was of the last of the rabbis of that time period. But I was thinking about ending. This is really kind of the end of this section, even though we're going to go into a story about Rabbi Bar Nachmani. But I wanted to kind of sum up here what we've done so far and make some sense out of some things and maybe connect it with what we've been learning. So we start off with Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, and we talked about, and based on this article of Rabbanit Shoshani, that a lot here about a path to doing tshuva. And if you see here, I want to point out a few things that I didn't yet point out really, which is in the beginning, Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon is involved in killing people, right? He's basically turning people into the authorities, and they end up getting murdered. Now, it's indirect, but he ends up causing death of people. And when he comes back into the Beit Midrash, that's where it starts. And then he basically brings life. All these women who come to ask him questions, he says, you can go back to your husbands, and they all bring life into the world, and they're all even called in Rabbi Elazar's name. And then we saw yesterday also that all the days that he was going through this suffering, and if you want to learn more about suffering and Jewish approaches to suffering, so yesterday on our site, Rabbanit Michelle Farber Shiur went up all about 2 different approaches to suffering among the rabbis, right? So it's great. All the extra content kind of fills in with the things that we don't have time to deal with, which is, what is the Jewish approach to suffering? And what are yisurim me'ahava, yisurim of love? And basically, he ends up, it says, all the times that he went through this suffering, nobody died before their time. So he somehow, after bringing death to the world, he ends up doing a complete turnaround and brings life to the world. And then if you look at Rebbe, the main theme of all the Rebbe stories, and I'm going to quote you a few lines that Rebbe says. It starts with Rebbe saying, Shlosham vatanim hem, right? He's compared in the beginning. He goes to marry Rabbi Shimon's wife and basically gets put down. You're a nobody. And he accepts it. He says, listen, I know he's greater than me in Torah. He tries to say maybe he's better than me in Maasim. Maybe I'm better than him in my actions. And then she says, you're not. And then Rebbe, after that, goes and says, I'm going to take Yisurin upon myself, right? So he's very humble. And you see it because he says, these are the humble people. He looks up to them. And it's all about humility. And then he basically goes, he says, so bring me Yisurin. He understands, right? He doesn't say, also when he was put down, right, on the floor, he doesn't complain. Rabbi Shimon complains. But Rabbi Yehuda doesn't complain. He takes it. He understands. And the whole point of putting him down there was not to bring ayin hara, and not for him to be arrogant and think it's all about me. And then he looks at Rabbi Chia and he says, another thing, Da'amar Rebbe, they quote all these statements, he says, we can string them together and kind of get a full picture of him. Kama gedolim ma'aseh Chia. What he's great at is seeing other people and what can I learn from those other people and saying, and how can I implement this into my life? Then he goes to Eliyahu and he sees Eliyahu talking about this, the strength of tefillah. And then he says, well, who is like that in our generation? And then he puts it together and he makes it happen. Now, of course, it was stopped by by Eliyahu, as the Shamayim had a whole to do about it. But he tries to make things happen from what he sees happening, and he takes lessons and he absorbs them. And that's all a person who has a lot of humility can do that. And I think it ends with this self-Mishnah. And if we understand this, Rabbi Yehuda haNasi is the one who put together the Mishnah. What is the act of putting together the Mishnah, if not an act of humility? Like what it kind of takes everything he learned, the humility, the harbatzat Torah of Rabbi Chia, that you have to spread Torah. What bigger way of spreading Torah than writing down the Mishnah? Right? That book became, the most popular book. If you also view the Gemara as made up of the Mishnah. So he basically takes all these lessons, and the putting together of the Mishnah is exactly that. If you notice, for example, his name does not appear much in the Mishnayot. He doesn't even write Rabbi Natan, doesn't appear there at all. And Rabbi Yehuda haNasi often brings opinions that were not his own opinions. He brings other people's opinions. He doesn't always have to put his opinion in there. Now, it's very hard for someone who's knowledgeable and confident to do that and say, oh, well, my opinion is not necessarily always important. And he does that. He's able to put that aside and say, I have a bigger goal here. And it's not all about me, and it's about spreading Torah, and this is the best way to spread Torah. And I think that this is almost possibly a lead-in to what it takes to be able to put together a book like the Mishnah, and it takes someone who is humble, like Rabbi Yehuda haNasi. Perhaps also they're using Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Shimon, who wasn't exactly humble, as a bit of a foil. He might have also been an amazing person, and what we learn from him is really the tshuva, doing tshuva and realizing the error of your ways and changing. But Rabbi Yehuda haNasi is really, it's all about humility. And if we think about this in the context of our discussion, okay, who remembers what we were even learning? We're learning about worker-employer relationships. And it's all about, that it's very easy as an employer to be arrogant and to set all the terms and to do things your own way and say, look, you work for me. And the whole thing we've been talking about a lot is this, avadayhem v'lo avadim la'avadim, right? God, we work for God. We don't work for other people. We're not slaves of other people. We're only slaves of God. And, in a positive way, not in, we're slaves of God. But we're all on the same level, and it requires a level of humility on behalf of the employer not to take advantage of the workers. And also this idea of tshuva, we have all these changes, oh, I don't want to do this. Oh, I don't want to do that. Oh, I promised this, I'm not doing that, and this idea of, you have to work on it, and you have to work on also your ben adam lechavero, how you treat other people. And it's a very important element to have in mind in these relationships. So perhaps that's a connection to what we've been learning. I'm sure you can think of a lot more connections. You have all of Shabbat to give it some thought. Now we're going to move on because we have a long daf. But what we're going to do today is finish up this section, go back to the Mishnah, but immediately digress back into Agadata. So it's a bunch more of Agadata world for a little while more. I'm a Rav Kahana. So now we start with Rav Kahana, and he says, Ishtayli Rav Chama Barbar Chasa. Rav Chama was the grandson, the son of the daughter of Chasa, told me the following story. Raba bar Nachmani, who was another great gadol, this is Raba, who we know, who was third generation, often argued with Rav Yosef, and he was also ends up arguing with Abai and Rava, who were the fourth generation, but they were sort of student colleagues. And what happened to him? Very terrible, tragic ending of his life. Agav shmada nafshi. He ends up losing his life because of the shmad, because of the foreign rule. And Rashi explains we're talking about because of fear of the king. We're going to see. It's going to take us a little while till we get there. We're going to hear the whole story of his death. So it starts off with Achlu be kortza be malka. They turn him into the king. This is obviously why the story's here, because it's like Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, who was turning people in. He gets turned in by somebody. How did they turn him in? They say, Amru ikacha gavra b'Yudai. They said there's a person in Judea. To come avatel tracer alpha gavra b'Yisrael. This is reminiscent. We're in Spirat Omer and almost at Lag BaOmer. By the way, I didn't mention it was the obvious connection. Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon and Lag BaOmer and the connection there. But there's and Rabbi, if you remember, Rabbi Akiva is known for his students, right? And the number 12,000 appears there in the story also. He basically causes 12,000 people, Yarcha b'kaita v'yarcha b'sitva, 1 month in the summer, 1 month in the winter, mikarga de malka, who basically avoid paying taxes. They would collect taxes once a year. And when they came the 2 months a year, when everyone was at the Shiur of Raba bar Nachmani, there was always the Yarchei Kala, twice a year, everybody would come learn, right? There were people who learned every day, but there were other, right, in the Beit Midrash, they were Yoshvei Beit Midrash, the people who that was their life, but most people worked, and twice a year they would go for these shiurim. We've talked about them before. And every year the king's people would come on those days, and the people weren't home and they couldn't collect the taxes because they were sitting in Rabbi bar Nachmani's shiur. So look, it's his fault. He's causing all these people not to pay the taxes. What did they do? Shadru pistaka de malka batre. They sent the king's person after him. Below Eshkache, they couldn't find him. Why couldn't they find him? Because Arik Ba'azal, he went and ran away from Pumbedita to Akra, me'Akra la'Agma, me'Agma l'Shichin, Mishichin l'Tzrifa, Mitzrifa la'Eina demaya, me'Eina demaya l'Pumbedita. He does this big circle around, ends up back in Pumbedita. I guess he thought by then they weren't going to be looking for him. Big mistake. But Pumbedita Eshkache, he ends up being found in Pumbedita. How so? Well, there's a story. Ikla pristika de malka. So again, the king's person comes. Lahu ushbisa de Rabbi. Comes to the place where the inn where Raba is staying. Krivu tacha kameh. So people put this table in front of him. It's not like nowadays we have a table and you put food on the table. Bringing the table meant bringing the food. Talked about this a lot in Pesachim. Comes up in all sorts of sugyot. They bring the table in front of him. Ashku tre kase v'dayu l'tacha mikameh. So they give him 2 cups of wine. Ding, ding, ding. Remember the whole thing, don't ever drink wine in pairs. This all came up in Pesachim also. Well, they give him 2 cups of wine. Rashi says it was totally unintentional. They didn't realize. And then they take the table away, meaning they're done. Hadr partsufe la'achore. His head flips around, and now his head is on backwards, okay? Because the evil spirits got to him, and now the Jews are in a big problem, right? A huge predicament. If this guy goes back and he says, look what the Jews did to me, huge anti-Semitism will ensue. They'll start killing Jews. So Amrule, they said to Raba, who's the big scholar, Mainadile, what are we going to do for him? Gavra Damanku, he works for the king. We're in major trouble. Amar lehu krivu tachal kameh says easy solution. Bring another table in front of him. Ashkiu chad kasa. Bring him 1 cup. Then they'll make it odd number. Vidayu l'tacha mikameh, and then take the table away so that nobody gives him another one. Vili tase, and he will be healed. Again, we go back to the healing and the power of the rabbis to heal people like Shmuel. Avadu lehachi v'itase. So they do exactly that, and he is healed. Amar, but what happened here? He gave away his secret because the guy now who came to work for the king says, Meida yadana de gavra de kabiina hachahu. The guy I'm looking for must be here, because he figured who else would have been able to know the solution. He heard what was going on, right? His head might have been on backwards, but he was aware of what was happening. So he searches and he finds him, but he doesn't turn him in. Here he has an interesting statement, and this connects back with the torturing and all the suffering those rabbis went through. Amar azil nemeha. He says, I'm going to go home right now. I'm not going to take you with me. But if they want to kill me, I will not reveal your secret. I'll go to the death with it. But if they torture me, I'm going to reveal my secrets, because I can't undergo torture. Okay, he doesn't have the wherewithal, like Rabbi and Rabbi Lazar had to undergo torture. He said, then I'm going to have to give you in. Now, we don't turn you in. We don't have what exactly happens here. The next thing we know, he's turned into the authorities. They bring him before the king or the king's people. So they put him in this jail and they lock the door. He prays for rachamim. Prat ashita, the wall crumbles. Arik va'azal agma. Again, he runs away. Okay, this arik word, he runs away, like before. He runs away and goes to the marshes. What's he doing? He sits on a stump of a tree there, a palm tree, and he starts learning. At this same time, we're now going to go to what's going on in the heavens. Up in the heavens, there's a big discussion in the yeshiva, a big machloket. You might think, well, what are the controversial topics they're talking about in Shemayim? You're going to be very surprised to hear. Not what you would think. Im baheret kodemet lelavan l'se'ar lavan tameh, im se'ar lavan kodem lebaheret tahor. So they start learning about leprosy. And they say, there's these signs of leprosy. There's this white mark and there's the white hair. And it has to go in this order. If the baheret, and this is just a known thing, if the baheret, the white mark, leprous mark, comes and then there's a white hair that grows, that's a sign of tzarat. You'll be tameh. But if the white hair was there before it had this white look to it, the white spot, then you're tahor. Here's the big question they had in Shamayim. Safek, what if we don't know? What do we do? And this is maybe bigger than just for leprosy, but what do you do in a case of safek? Hakadosh Baruch Hu omer tahor. So God said tahor. Kulu mativta dirakia. Everyone else in the heavens, amre tameh. They all said you're impure. So we have this huge machloket, God against everybody else. Crazy to think about this situation. Amre man nochach. So they said, who's going to help us figure this out? Nochach Raba bar Nachmani. So in the heavens, they start talking about Raba bar Nachmani. He's the guy. Interesting why they say he's the guy. This maybe teaches you about arrogance. Be careful what you say and don't be too full of yourself, because what happened? Rabbi bar Nachmani said about himself, I'm the only guy who knows tzarat well. I'm the only guy who knows alot well, right? The two topics that are the most complicated topics that everybody tries to avoid, and I guess they did in those days also. He says, I'm the only one who knows this stuff. So basically they said, we have no choice but to bring Rabbi bar Nachmani up here. How are you going to get him up to Shamayim? If not, kill him. So, right, you might be thinking, wait, didn't he die because of fear of the king? This sounds like he died for a totally different reason. Shadru shlicha batre. So they send a messenger to get him, which is none other than Malach HaMavet, the angel of death. Lo v'matzei Malach HaMavet l'mikrevle. But why can't the angel of death get to him? We know this from other stories. Because what's he doing? He's sitting on the tree stump learning. And if you learn, that protects you from death. Because he just didn't stop learning. Saw a story in the Gemara about this of David Melech also. Adahachi nashav sika, a wind blows. V'avish beine kane, and it goes between the reeds, which makes a noise. Now, what does Rabba bar Nachmani say? Okay, anyone who's living in Israel now, I think gets a little bit sensitive when you hear noises. I was in America and I heard the planes go by because my parents live near the airport, and in the middle of the night, the planes are going by and I'm thinking, what's going on? And then I realized, oh, we're just near JFK. But anyway, right? It's noises. You get very sensitive. So he was very nervous about the king catching him. He hears the wind blowing. What does he think? Savar gunda de parashehu. He thinks that it's the king's men coming after him. And the horses, Amar, Chinaf nafshe dahu gavra v'lo yimaser biyada de malchuta. So here you see it. The fear of this scares him. He says, I'd rather die than be given over to the king. And also now the Malach HaMavet can get him because he stopped learning. So he dies. Amar, as he was dying, what does he say? Tahor, tahor. Very fascinating. Again, you have this one rabbi against all the other rabbis, like the Rabbi Elazar ben Horkin's story. Even there, the walls were falling. Here, the walls were falling, and all these miracles were happening. And he basically, right, and it's one guy alone on the side of God, everybody else on the other side. He says, Tahor, tahor, yatzda bat kova amra. Again, heavenly voice, like in that story. Ashrecha Rabba bar Nachmani shegufcha tahor v'yatza nishmatcha b'tahor. Okay, we had that. I didn't check everywhere, but we had it with the death of Rabbi Akiva. And maybe even with Rabbi Elazar ben Horkinos, it happened. I can't remember all the people but there's a bunch of people that, their nishama left with the words tahor in their mouths. Okay, it's like an image for some unique type of death. That's the story of how he died. Now we're going to get the after story. What happened on earth after Rabbi bar Nachmani was taken to the heavens? Again, kind of strange story. Nafku Abaye v'Rava b'kulu Rabbanan liyasukebe. So the great rabbis of that generation go to deal with him. Lo have yade duchte. Well, what's the problem? They don't know where he is. They hear that he's dead. Oh, did I skip something? Yeah, sorry. I skipped the important part. How did they know he died? Nafil pitka mirikia b'pubedita. Okay, these takim fall from the sky also sounds like the war now when they drop letters to people, tell them to evacuate. Anyway, all these takim notes fall from the sky. Rabbi bar Nachmani nitbakesh b'yeshiva shamala. He was needed in the heavens above. Okay, which is really what happened, right? So again, if you believe this really happened, this is a story. This didn't exactly happen in this way. It's trying to tell us something. So what happened? They all go, but what's the problem? They have no idea where he is. So they go to the marsh, which is where he was, right? But they didn't know that. But when they get to the marsh, as they send out a search team, when they get to the marsh, they see something strange. They see tzipore de metala levakaime. They see all these birds kind of shaded over at some area. Amre, they see a whole hullabaloo going on. Amre shmamina hatamu, they say it must be the body's there. It sounds like they don't even find the body, but they just assume that's where it is, or maybe they find it. It's not clear. Safdu tzlata yoma b'tzlata lavata. So they start the process of mourning for him 3 days and 3 nights. Nafal pitka. And then they're done. They think 3 days, 3 nights, that's enough. But again, a note comes down from the heavens. Anyone who stops right now will be excommunicated. That's not enough. Rabbi Bar Nachmani deserves more than 3 days. Safduhu shiva yome. So they do 7 days. Nafal pitka. Again, note falls down from the heavens. Lechu lebeitchem l'shalom. Okay, that's enough. Go home. And they go home. Another thing that happens on the day that he dies, a big, strong wind comes. Again, we see the wind. The wind comes and blows this Arab merchant, that's a taya, Kirachiv Gamla, who is riding on a camel, he's on one side of the river, and he gets thrown off to the other side of the river. Amar my hai, he says, what is going on? And in fact, God answers him. Okay, interesting. Amar nafshe de Rabba bar Nachmani, or somebody tells him. Okay, maybe it says Amre, people, they said. Someone said Rabbi Bar Nachmani died, but why did I say God? Because he goes directly to God now. Okay, so it wasn't really God who said it, but people tell him Rabbi Bar Nachmani, this great person dies, and there's wind going, and obviously it's showing God's angry. So he says, Amar lefanav ribono shel olam, God, kule alma didachu, the whole world is yours. But Rabbi Bar Nachmani didach, and Rabbi Bar Nachmani is yours. Ate Raba, but Rabbi didach is beautiful, like ani l'dodi v'dodi li. You're with Raba, Raba's with you. What are you so unhappy about? You got what you wanted. Why are you destroying the world? Nachzapa, and God's anger subsides, and everything's calm. Strange what we do with this, that some foreigner comes and basically wakes up God into, calming down, and that's the way the story ends. Okay, moving on. There's a lot, you can think about these stories. I spent my time more thinking about the bigger story and the ones we did, but you can think about what the messages are here. Rabbi Shimon bar Chalafta, last section for this, Baal Basar Hava. He was also very overweight. We have all the stories about the rabbis being overweight. Yom Echad Hava Chamim Alei. It was very hot for him. Hava Salik V'Yatav Ashina Deturi. He goes up to the peak of the mountain. This is going to be the most windy there. Again, we get back to this idea of wind. Amalei the Barte, he says to his daughter, Biti Anif Alai B'Minifav Ani Aten Lach Ki Karin de Nerd. I'll give you a lot of perfume. Nerd was this beautiful perfume. And, as long as you please fan me, and I'll give you a gift. Adahachi, but in the meanwhile, nashvazika, a wind came, which a God brought wind, to which he says, Amar kama kikarim de ner lamari dichi. How many kikarim of ner do I need to bring to God? In other words, basically saying, thank you, God, I appreciate that you brought the wind. And maybe this is, again, appreciating that everything comes from God. Okay, end of section, going back to the Mishnah. Hakol kiminhaga medina. If you remember, what was our Mishnah talking about? Our Mishnah was talking about your requirements as an employer, what you have to do to your employee, about food, about time of work, and all that. So we said when it comes to food, hakol kiminhaga medina. It really depends on what's common practice in your neighborhood. To which the Gemara says, hakol latu yamai. What are you saying, hakol? Why everything is like minhaga medina? It sounds like it's including something additional. So now they're going to say not only the things we discussed in the Mishnah, but in a place where people give you bread and drink first thing in the morning before you go to work, the employer gives it to you. And if this employer says, if the employer says, first you go to work, I'll give you your food later, even that he can't do. They could say, this is very important. They always say, workers, you have to know your rights. You should stand up and say, no, that is not the rights that I'm deserving of. These are my rights, and you have to provide them to me. If you remember, he said, go get me workers. The son goes out and gets workers and promises them food. And when he comes back and tells the father says, why'd you do that? You just said food? That's going to mean that I'm going to have to give them food, not even as much as Shlomo HaMelech. They can claim that I didn't even give them because They're the sons of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, who were deserving even more than Shlomo HaMelech. That's going to get us into a whole discussion. What was the meal of Shlomo HaMelech? What was the meal of Avraham? From there, we're going to get into Avraham and the meal he served the angels. And from there, we're going to get into a whole analysis, a drashot of that story. So first, the Gemara asks, Ma'aseh Listol? Wait a minute. Didn't we say Akol Minhag Medina? So if he promised them food, shouldn't it just be defined by the Minhag Medina? Now, obviously, the Minhag Medina was not that every employer gives their employees a banquet, a full-fledged banquet every day. It's missing words, and this is how you should read it. Now, you get like Minhag Medina, but if you promise more than that, turning out Amubet, riba lahim, then you have to give them more. And that's why he got into trouble here. And then they bring this maaseh to show that here was a case where he promised them more. And then he said, you better work it out with them that you're just giving them bread and legumes, because otherwise they're going to sue me in court and force me to pay them millions of dollars. So Maaseh Nami Rabbi Yochanan ben Matia, and here we're just going to quote it. Shamar lebenot says Lanu Palim, go hire me workers or us workers. Halachu pasak lemesamnot. Basically promised them food. Ukshebai to Laviv Amarlo, when he got to his father, he said to him, Bini, my son, afilu atau selan k'sudat Shlomo b'shato, even if you make him a sudat like Shlomo would serve at the time, or was served at the time, lo yatzati yedei chovatcha imahem, wouldn't have fulfilled your obligation. Shehem b'nei Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov, because they're the sons of Avraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, period. Lememra, now the big question comes: is sudata da Avraham Avinu adifa midish Shlomo? Avraham Avinu served food more lavish, meals more lavish than Shlomo? Really? Let's talk about Shlomo first. It's going to take us a little while to get through all of what Shlomo served. Haktiv, and in the beginning of Sefer Melachim, Melachim Aleph, there's a whole description of all the food that Shlomo would serve. Okay, big description. And it was all about his wealth, everything. It's described in great detail. And it says, V'i lechem Shlomo liyom echad. The bread of Shlomo for one day was shloshim kor solet, 30 kor of solet. That's a huge amount. Remember, a kor is 30 se'ah. So we're talking 30 kor of solet, shishim kor kemach, double the amount of, right? That was the solet, fine flour. 60 kor of kemach, of regular flour. Asara bakar bri'im, asara bakar bri'i. Okay, 10 healthy bakar, livestock. 10 ones that were like ro'eh, in the fields. Me'at son, 100 sheep and lambs and all that. Levad mi'ay lutzvi v'yachmor baruim abasim. In addition to the rams and the deer and the yachmor and the barbarim. Okay, in addition to all this other stuff that he had. Now the baruim abasim, we're going to get into a whole discussion what that is. But Amar Gorion ben Astion, it's an interesting name, Mishmei de Rav. He said in the name of Rav, all this stuff, the kemach and the solet, by the way, halalu le'emilan shel tapachim. That wasn't even what they ate. That was just used. It would absorb the bad steam that would come from the food. They would put it at the top of the pot to absorb the steam. That was used just for that. Okay, forget about, they ate way more than that. Okay, they would prepare. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, halalu litzikei k'teira. The meat was like the stuff that got stuck at the bottom of the pot, what they were describing. That was like the extras. Okay, so you're talking, it was even more than this, according to the rabbis. But Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, and not only that, get this one. Elef nashim ayu l'shlomo. He had 1,000 wives. Kol echat ve'echat astalu b'beit hakach. Okay, I know I struggle with making dinner every night. These women had to make dinner for their husband. Not look at the meal they had to make. Not even knowing if he was showing up. They each made a meal like that every day. My time, why? Because those for us, Shema, it's liso edayom. Each one thought maybe he'll be eating here tonight for dinner. And I think about how I always check in with my kids. Are you home for dinner? You're not home for dinner, right? Could you imagine every night making a meal like this, thinking maybe Shlomo will come and maybe he'll just walk in the door, maybe he won't. So each one thought maybe he'll be by me tonight, maybe he'll be by me tonight. So it's all this food times a huge amount, because that was just the extras, and the side. Then times 1,000 wives. That is a huge amount of food. Now, Avraham, let's zoom into Avraham. So he ran to get bakar, to get the meat. And it says he took a ben bakar, which right now sounds like one, rach v'tov, soft and good. Rabbi Yehuda Rav ben bakar chad rach shnayim v'tov shlosha. Okay, so Rav here says it was actually 3. still not getting even close to Shlomo HaMelech. Okay, but there were three. Hatam tlate Torah litlate gavre. There, okay, so here comes our big answer. There it was 3 animals for 3 people. Now think about it. Okay, we don't live in a slaughterhouse, right? That's not what we do, but you can figure out that 1 animal goes, right, per person. That's a lot of food. So what they're saying is the following. He did 3 animals for 3 people, which is a lot. And then, why is that actually more than Shlomo? Because per capita, hacha lechol Yisrael v'Yehuda. We thought it was Shlomo's meal. Apparently, all the cooking they did for Shlomo was to feed all the Jewish people. Now, let's talk about how many Jews there were in the time of Shlomo. Shene'emar, Yehuda v'Yisrael rabim kechol asher al hayam. They're like the sand in the water, in the sea. So that was to feed all the Jewish people. So per capita, actually, it was more because everyone got a teeny little piece of meat. But when it came to Avraham, each one got a whole animal. And there you have it. Now we're going to go into something else, which is what are these barburim avusim, which basically means fattened up hens. They feed them. The avos, by the way, is the trench where they would put the food in, the where the animals eat from. So basically, they would force feed them to get them fat, to fatten them up. Shmuel disagrees and says they just eat a lot, okay, on their own. Not that they're force fed, but they get fat because they eat a lot. Rabbi Yochanan amar mevi'im tormi marito b'delo anis v'tarnagolim me'ashprata b'delo anisa. The barburim avusim and the other animals they brought were animals that had never worked, but it was supposed to be better, as they had never worked, so it didn't weaken them at all. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, or they were fat because they didn't work. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, they weren't in good shape, which for an animal is good, for a human maybe not as good. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, muvchar shebebehemot shol, muvchar shebe'ofot tarnagolet. Okay, this is just a statement about the best of the birds is the tarnagolet, is the hen, and the best of the animals is the ox. Amar Amemar, another interpretation of avusim is zagta uchmata be'bitnita demishtaka bene atzre. This is a darkened hen that has a big stomach. That's the bitnita, has a big stomach. Demishtaka bene atre. She goes between the wine press and she eats, whoever thought this would make you fat, she eats all the dregs left from the grapes. And because she eats them all, she's so fat that delo Matia pasikane, she can't even walk on the reeds that are hanging out there. It's very hard for her to walk because she's so fat. Okay, either which way, that was apparently a delicacy. We'll learn in another minute about another delicacy. So now we're going to go to Avraham and go through all these psukim about when the angels come to visit Avraham, and they're there to tell him all these messages, which we're going to get to, which you probably know anyway, but we're going to go and we're going to see some famous ones, some less famous ones. Avraham. So Rav Yehuda, first we're going to talk about quantities that we already discussed, that Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rav. We're going back to this line, Ben bakar chad rach shnayim v'tov shlosha. The Gemara is going to take a little issue with this, as you can imagine, because it really sounds, according to the simple reading, that it was 1. So how'd you get to 3? Ve'em achad. Why don't you just say it was 1? Just like people will say, I got a good, soft piece of meat. That's the way someone would talk, and that's what Avraham seems to be saying. It should have then said soft, good, soft piece of meat, right? I didn't say the word end, even though you could say end there pretty simply grammatically, but my vatov, why is the vav there? Shema mina lidrash. That vav must be to darshan. So there you get to, well, you don't get to 3 then, you get to 2. There's only 1 vav. So the Gemara says, okay, well then aim a tray. Maybe it's just 2 animals because 1 vav. But they say, miditov lidrasha, rachnami lidrasha. Well, there's 3 words and there's 1 vav. Well, it must be each of the 3 words signifies another animal. And therefore, since there's these 2 extra words, it must mean 2 extra animals, rach and tov. And therefore, we're going to darshan 3. Another question, though, they're still struggling with the numbers because look later on in the story. Matia Raba Barula, V'yitema Rav Oshaya, V'yitema Rav Natan bar Rabbi Oshaya. One of these people said this. V'yiten el hanahal, v'yimaher lasototel. So Avraham gets the bakar, and then he gives it to the nar, to the person working for him, and v'yimaher lasototel. Notice it says he gives it to the nar, and the nar does it. It is singular, not otam, plural. To which they answer, he gave to 3 different narim. This pasuk just described what he did to 1, and then it was done times 3. We're still not satisfied because then it says, well, then he took the the butter and the milk and the meat, ben bakar asher asa vayitem lifnehem, and he gives it in front of them. Now, it says the bakar asher asa, again, singular. This sounds like a really bad restaurant. De kama kama de Matia aita the kamai. Each one, as it was finished, as it was prepared and it was ready, they brought it out, right? This would annoy people I know in restaurants, right? You get there and they bring one meal at one, and then 10 minutes later, they bring the other. You know, it was brought in single portions. Okay, and then when it was ready, they would bring it out. But now, okay, fine. Maybe you could read in the Psukim that it was 3, but why? Why do you need 3? Why not just 1? Right? It's certainly enough to feed 3 people. Here comes the delicacy. The tongue of the animal, which only there's 1 per animal, was a delicacy, and he wanted to feed them that in mustard, and therefore he brought that. So now we're done with the numbers, and now we're moving on to something else. You should never change the custom, obviously connected with our idea of custom. So you should never veer from the custom where you are. When Moshe went up to the heavens to get the Torah, or went up to Har Sinai, but kind of in conversation with God, he acted like an angel, and he didn't eat food. They don't eat food, he didn't eat food. And when they came down to earth, the Malachim here, they ate bread. What, you really think they ate? No, they didn't eat, obviously. To which they answered, well, they made themselves look like they were eating and drinking. They obviously didn't eat. To which Tosfot says, what are you talking about? There's in Seder Eliyahu Raba, it says, no, they really did eat. Just like Moshe didn't eat, they really did eat. Anyway, it's a big machloket here, and Gefet this week is all about this topic, about this midrash. Usually it's more halachic. This time it's on a Tosfot that deals with Haggadah. Fascinating shiur of Yael Shimoni about this idea: did the angels eat or did they not eat? It also, by the way, reminds me of this midrash that we learned also in the Gemara about when they were getting the Torah, and the Malachim said, you can't give the Torah to the Jewish people, like they do all sorts of mundane things. And, you can't give it to humans, give it to us. And then God said, no, the Torah was not given to Malachei Hasharet. It's not for angels. And there's a whole fascinating story there. And here it's again, Moshe and the angels. It's like this play between, here they're actually switching roles. Moshe becomes like an angel, the angels become human. Anyway, and you can listen to Gefet to hear more about it. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Avraham למלאכי השרת בעצמו, עשה הקדוש ברוך הוא לבניו בעצמו. Everything Avraham did by himself here, and this is like Rabbi Chia, who we saw taught everyone, he did everything by himself. Whatever Avraham did by himself, which shows you should do things on your own, God later rewards Avraham by doing it to the Jewish people, something parallel on his own, and not with a messenger. And anything Avraham did by sending a messenger, God did by a shaliach. But we're going to hear the things Avraham did and what God did in place of that. And most of these are kind of as they got out of Egypt, or soon after that, or as they got the Torah, which was all in the similar time period. Avraham, or actually, except for this first one. He ran to get the bakar, and Ruach Nasa Me'et Hashem, and this is when God brought the slav in the time of the dead. Later, when the people were complaining they had no meat, God went and brought the meat himself. It says Ruach Nasa Me'et Hashem. God did this on his own. Vayikach hama v'chalav. He went and got the milk and the butter. Hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim. When God brought the man, he brought the man directly. V'hu omer alehem tachat ha'etz. He went out to greet the angels on his own. Okay, this is in after they get out of Egypt in Shmot Yud Zayin. This is when they had no water, and they brought the water. Similar story, right? They needed food, they needed meat, they needed water, right? And all those things God provided, just like Avraham provided food for these angels. But Avraham olech yomam imam l'shacham. He directed them out. This is after they got out of Egypt, and it says that God was guiding them. You should have some water. And then God makes the water happen, and he's right there. Rabbi Chanina, who had a bit of a different approach to this, the same idea, but different things that were in place of different things. To Amar Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Ishmael, Bishchar Shlosha Zachu L'Shlosha. in reward for 3 things that Avraham did, they got 3 things. That was similar. He was standing at the gate Amud Anan. It's the water later, the Be'er of Miriam that went with them through the desert. Here, Avraham makes a big mistake, which costs him big. You think it's nice, he washed their feet. But they said to him, what, you confuse us for pagan Arabs who basically bow down to the dust on their feet, and you didn't want us to do that in your house, so you washed our feet off so there would be no dust on our feet. And his punishment was that he had a son, Yishmael, who, and he already had this son, and that son went off and worshipped idols. So now God appears there, and Avraham sitting there in the middle, heat of the day. So my famous midrash here, so it was the 3rd day after he had the Brit Milah, which is the one that's the most painful. God came levaker cholim, so to speak, right, to visit the sick. Why was it the sun? Why was it so strong that day? He didn't want, he knew Avraham loves guests. He said, this is not the day. So he made it so hot that Avraham wouldn't go out. That didn't stop Avraham. So so instead of going himself, he sends Eliezer. He said, listen, there's no guest today. Amar lo mehem nalach. He says, I don't believe you. This is how people say they're late. Nobody can trust slaves. He didn't trust Eliezer. He went himself. Nothing you. He goes out himself. He sees God standing outside. That's where he says, don't leave. Let's stay with me. Like, maybe I need your help because I'm sick, but I want to do this mitzvah anyway. Unclear exactly what he means here. Well, what does he notice though? God's there, and Avraham is untying his bandage where his Brit Milah was. Amar lav or he says, listen, this is not appropriate for me to be here right now. God says this is not the right, thing. And this explains why it says he looked up. There were 3 people standing on him, like as if they were right there. But then it says vayar it's like vatam, but then he goes to run after them. So it must be mikara atu kamu ale. First they were with him. When they saw that he was in pain and he was tying and untying his bandage, they said, this isn't our place to be here, and they walked away, and that's why he ran after them. Who were they? Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. So what is the job of each one? Michael Shabala Vaseret Sarah. He comes to tell Sarah she's going to have a son. Raphael Shabala Rapet Avraham. Raphael, right? Rofei, doctor. He comes to cure Avraham. Gabriel Azal Mehapche stone. Gabriel is the one to destroy stone. Now we have a little problem with this, and with this we'll finish. 2 came to stone. So why only one? Why does it say only one came but 2 went into stone? One came to save Lot. So one came to destroy stone, the other one came to save Lot. You can infer this from the pasuk. And he turned over the city, singular. From there you can see that only one did the actual, right? Each one had their role and fulfilled their role, one person to one Misima, although Michael gets the second one. Okay, with this, we'll finish our daf. A lot to think about over Shabbat, a lot of interesting stories, and we'll pick up with these stories in the next daf. It continues. We're going to start by a comparison of Lot and Avraham, which is always a famous thing to be doing. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a great day and a Shabbat Shalom and B'sorot Tovot.